Hello students! So today we are going to be going through chapter 3 in the Dunn and Halonen book. So let's talk about should you major in psychology, and what we talked about people who do and do not major in psychology. This is a little bit more what you can gain from your major in psychology, what you can take out of the major even if you're not ending up in a psychology focused career. But it is definitely, the whole book is really focused on psychology careers. So let's get into it. So one of the things that the book really emphasized is knowing yourself. So knowing what kind of talents, abilities, things like that you have that you might make you well suited for doing psychology, as well as that you can use as tools within doing work in psychology too. So they talk a lot about personality traits. So I wanted to talk just a little bit of a rant on traits versus characteristics. So developmental psychologists, most of us, see the idea of traits as being kind of a silly thing. A lot of people doing personality work also see them as not as trait-like as they used to see them as. Originally, so I guess history-wise, traits were originally supposed to be these pretty solid things that across time, across situations, these personality traits would stay the same. So whether you are extroverted, introverted, that would be the same. Whether you're in a new place, in a place you're familiar with, a workplace, a school, church, community, at the post office, that you would be extroverted or introverted. And that trait would be consistent in different places and across time. So if you measured someone was extroverted today, let's say an adult, you measured an adult to be extroverted today, the assumption was a couple of years from now they would still be extroverted. So traits were supposed to be pretty stable things that you could kind of count on and use to predict other things as multiple variables. So if you knew 20 personality traits of someone, you could hopefully predict how they might behave in a certain situation because they should be pretty stable. What researchers started realizing as they had better methods and as we added in other variables and could do a better job measuring things is that traits didn't tend to be as solid as we once wished that they would be. So a lot of personality psychology, you might actually get personality psych combined with a social psych class now, depending on what school you're in. You might still have separate courses. It really just depends on the school, how many extra courses they're offering, things like that. So because social situations do have a lot of power, developmental psychologists realize this too. The different contexts affect things. So you might be really, so let's get a little definition of introverted versus extroverted. It's not just like, it's not shy, it's not like outgoing, it's how do you get your energy in a situation. So if you're extroverted, you want to be around people, you want to be interacting with them, having a lot of social interactions. Introverted person probably wants to have fewer of those kind of interactions to feel their best, right? So you might see that person or maybe say they're shy, but it might just be that they maybe have a small group of friends that then when they're with that small group of friends, they are very like loud, outgoing, things like that, and you might not see that in a classroom setting, right? So in a different setting, someone who might be introverted might be acting very different from one situation to the next. So that's an example of one of these characteristics. So it's a terminology thing. So trait was supposed to be a stable thing. Characteristics suggest that maybe they're a little more malleable in different situations. So with that being said, jumping back to this now, developmental psychologists, we realize, hey, these traits are not really as stable as we once thought, so let's use a different term. Characteristics, things like that, are a little softer terms, suggesting that things can be a little different, or people might behave different in different situations. And you might see that too. With your immediate family, you probably behave quite different than when you're with a big group of extended family. If you're at a funeral versus a party for a birthday, you're probably going to be behaving pretty differently, even though a lot of your core sense of self, your identity is the same. A lot of your characteristics are displaying differently in those different situations. So The book focuses here on personality traits, and I think it's to a detriment because they talk about things like career assessments from personality traits, and like we just talked about, they're not really as stable as we tend to think they are. So, a personality trait assessment in and of itself isn't going to be the best way to necessarily know yourself. It might give you some ideas, right? So, it's not that they're completely invalid measures, it's just that traits are not always as consistent across situations as we used to hope that they would be and try to use them in research for that way. So, with that being said, different career assessments, I don't really have a good suggestion of a valid one to use. When I've gone through different job hiring processes, some of them I've known, like the assessments that they've given me, and I've been like, why are you using this? This is really not a valid tool. What's the purpose of this? And maybe they're actually using it to like start up conversation or other things. But with that, if you go searching for career assessment types of things, do understand your personality characteristics are malleable. They can change over time as well. So while you might be rating high on extroversion now, in a few years, maybe you're not. Maybe you're, in most situations, you're not extroverted anymore. That can happen too. People can change a lot during different times of their lives. There's a lot of change. That's what developmental psych is very focused on. Those of you who've been in my developmental psych class, you know these things. I've probably, hopefully, hammered them into your brain enough that this is a lot of repetition right now. So with that being said, they could be these career assessments, even the personality trait types of ones. Don't do the Myers-Briggs. That one's really not valid. Other than that, though, it might give you a little bit of insight, and it won't be harmful to have additional tools. So with that, in the realm of knowing yourself, whatever tools you use to find and understand yourself, your fit with your occupation is important. So do the talents and abilities, do the characteristics that you have, do they lend themselves well to doing well in this occupation? Can you bring a lot to the table? Are you going to enjoy your time there? And that's what a lot of today is going to be focused on, talking about from chapter 3. So things that can help you figure this out earlier are things like shadowing. So as early as possible, and depending on restrictions or things based on jobs or health crises or things like that, you may or may not be able to shadow in certain types of instances. So you're probably not going to be shadowing in a locked clinical ward of a hospital, for example. But you may be able to shadow in, say, a crisis call center or something like that. Also, speaking to professionals in the field can help you understand what the professionals actually do on a day-to-day basis. So you might have a really romanticized idea about the kind of job you want to be doing. It might have come from media, which we've talked about doesn't always have the most accurate view of what psychologists do. So speaking to professionals in the field, you might even have some courses throughout your coursework that ask you to do formal interviews with professionals as part of your assignment. So that can be really helpful. But doing that as well when you meet someone, reaching out to someone, emailing someone in the field that's doing a similar job that you think you might want to do, and talking to them. That might end up being someone who becomes a mentor or things like that. Or you might realize also that the kind of work that's being done isn't actually what you want to do. Knowing that earlier, knowing that that doesn't fit with what you want is really good too. So not just finding that it fits, but also finding things that don't fit is really important. So internships are obviously a really great way to help with that. Usually with an internship, you will have some kind of advisor or mentor with you through the process, and be able to do some of the work as well, or shadow at the same time. So it kind of combines the doing the work with the shadowing and the speaking to professionals in the field. You can watch videos or get books from people in the field. So even if you can't speak with a professional in the field by email or phone call or have a meeting or something like that, you might be able to find videos or books or blogs or things like that from people in the field that share what the actual work is. Podcasts might work too. So asking your instructors. So not all of them are doing teaching exclusively. Some of them might have clinical practice, for example. Some of them might be doing research. So ask them about those things, especially if it's something that you think you might be interested in. See what the actual kind of work that they do is. How did they get there to that point? What abilities or skills do they think were essential in getting the kinds of positions that they have. These are really useful for knowing if what you want to do is a good fit, skills that you might need to gain. Because right now you're still in school, it's a perfect time to work on building specific skills, maybe choosing specific classes to help you build those skills, or see if you need other additional training if you don't feel like the curriculum you can take through the school is going to give you the tools that you need. So the book also spends a lot of time talking about meaning versus money and motivation in the job, and we'll talk a lot about meaning today. But one of the key studies that they cite here is an old positive psych study that talked about basically after you are making $75,000 a year, your happiness, your well-being is not strongly correlated with the amount of money that you make. So basically, as long as you're not impoverished, if you're making enough money, making more money on top of that isn't correlated to well-being. So like I mentioned, is an older study. We've seen there's a lot more variables involved in this relationship than simply making that much money. So you might think already, well, it depends on where you live. Might be one variable. Some places cost of living is cheaper than other places. Obviously that's one obvious variable that might impact it. An additional thing is work-life balance, and this is one thing they do focus on in the book, is important. So being able to do work that you can also come home from, that you have other additional hobbies. You might find your work really meaningful or even purposeful, but having other things outside that too is important. So they do make a claim that as people make more money, the time they need to devote to work increases substantially. And so they're using this statement essentially as an argument to say, hey, be happy with the slightly lower wages on average in psychology versus some other STEM fields. But the statement itself has some problems. So saying like if you're trying to make more money, you need to devote more time to that. And so they say that I was like, hey, don't keep like pushing for more money. 75,000, that's a good number, correlated to well-being. Well, you probably know a ton of people who already work, maybe even you yourself, work incredibly high hours and don't make more money. The very wealthy don't actually spend as many hours on tasks that you and I might consider work. So probably in class would be a better place for these examples. Interviews with people who are really wealthy is one thing I've done for various projects, not specifically looking at like wealth, but things like purpose in life, their lifespan, things like that. So different kind of interview projects I've done have sampled not just the very wealthy, but have included them. And so it's interesting to hear the kind of things that they do on their workday. When they mention they block off 4 hours for reading a book during their workday in the office, I'm like, man, that sounds really nice. I wish I had time to read outside of all the hours of work I'm putting into things. So I wouldn't necessarily have called that or said that is a work task. That's something that I would be expected by my employers to do outside of work. So that's something that you might see also, is that they are very wealthy, but maybe the time that they're spending isn't tasks that you might not necessarily see those as work tasks. Obviously it is building up their own self, they're learning, they're growing. In a lot of the positions that you and I are probably doing in the working class, we don't have that kind of luxury or opportunity. We have to do that on our own time. So more recent research does do a lot better job at looking at all these other variables that go into that basic $75,000 number correlated with well-being. So here it looks like a big wall of text. This is just the title and the authors of this paper. So it's a lot newer. It's a good meta-analysis. So as I've talked about, a meta-analysis is basically taking the stats from multiple studies. So there's been a lot of studies on well-being and income level as well as additional variables. So this meta-analysis basically took all of those, put the stats together to find, okay, a more representative sample of how much is income correlated to well-being. So I don't expect you to read this entire abstract. If you want to, pause right now, pause after I summarize a couple things and read it. So a couple things I wanted to point out. We've talked about correlations. So you can see some of these correlations here. So an R of 0.32, that's a reasonable relationship between things. Of R of 0.16, that's very low. Like there's a relationship there, obviously, with as big as these samples are. 357 studies with a total of 2 million over 300,000 participants. So this is a real relationship that exists. So probably pretty representative of a population actually, but the relationship isn't super strong. So we talked about maybe some strong relationships like R of 0.7, and you can see none of these correlations are even close to that high. This was one of the highest ones found. So the point of this being, I'm just pointing out some correlations, some of those R's, demystify this abstract a little bit for you. But the main thing here is socioeconomic status. So again, that's not just income level, but income level tends to be like one of the big, one of the included variables to calculate socioeconomic status. Then subjective well-being. So how high do you feel your well-being is? So not an outside observer, not a partner or doctor or therapist rating your well-being. Like how high do you feel your well-being is? Like that includes not only happiness, but do you feel healthy as well? Do you feel like you're doing things that you want to be doing? So there's a lot that goes into well-being besides only happiness, but hopefully that's a good little brief summary. All right, so with this, some of the main findings here are that these relationships are not super strong, but they do exist. So the subjective socioeconomic status well-being association was larger than the objective association. So people, they felt like it was more associated, or their feelings of well-being were different than their actual rated well-being. So different scales might do that. So here are a couple of the variables. So income, subjective well-being association was larger, was comparable with the, here we go, the education. So education was a variable that they looked at. They looked at also things like wealth and population density, so the wealth of the community that they lived in, as well as how dense the population, were also big associations that impacted how much socioeconomic status and subjective well-being were related. Then we also see decrease in income inequality, so in areas with lower income inequality, so more balance between people's incomes, that the rating was higher, so your income level and subjective well-being was more correlated. Also, if you felt that you had relative social mobility, that was a big factor too. So it's not just that basic $75,000 number that goes into this. If you feel you have more social mobility, you're going to have more subjective well-being. If there's less income inequality, you're going to feel like you have higher subjective well-being. So more than just income level and more than just that kind of key $75,000 number goes into that. So again, that's what research does, right? It finds a finding, and then we look at it in more detail. Other researchers said, oh, I wonder if that works in this sample, and this sample, and this sample, in 357 different samples. I wonder if this variable or this variable affects this in a different way. And what we found is, yeah, it's not as simple as just making that $75,000. You can make less, but if you have these things, if you feel like you have social mobility, the income inequality is less, if you're in a place with wealth closer to your level of wealth, a bigger population density, then you're going to have higher subjective well-being than someone who's making more than you, but with the opposite of all of those things. Right? So it's not just down to that basic number. It's a nice, easy number to like put out there. But again, that's the beginning of that research. This is where we are. This paper was 2020, and meta-analysis of all these studies. And this is why, this is one, hey, this is how we do science. We have that number, we put it out there. You might have even heard it before, but this is where the research shows now. Also a good example of the kind of things you'll be looking into with your literature review. You might find an older study that's really relevant, and hopefully some newer studies that add complexity to it or answer the questions that you might have from that first article. And that's a lot of what scientists do. See, when you hear or read or hear me describe this study, this abstract, you might say, well, what about this? Then that might inspire a new study to go on to that angle, right? So here, again, we probably have a lot of population included in that many studies and that many people. So it's probably pretty representative of, I think this was all US samples, which is another thing that we'll talk about in one of our future discussions. So let's jump back to one of the main points of this chapter, which is finding meaning in the work in psychology. So what is meaningfulness? Well, meaningfulness is, or finding things that are meaningful, is just things that matter to you, things that intrinsically motivate you to do or to enjoy. So you find a lot of different things meaningful. So you can find cooking versus eating enjoyable. So you could find walking in the woods enjoyable or meaningful. You can find interacting with animals or people really meaningful to you. So that's what meaning is. That is different, well, when we get to researchers more recently. Purpose is something separate and different, but still under the umbrella of meaning. So purpose adds to that meaning goals and contributing to things beyond yourself. So I'll kind of tear those apart a little bit, and so separate them. So I do hope that you find your work in the field of psychology meaningful. I hope the jobs that you do, the work that you do, is meaningful to you. It's important to you. You find it intrinsically motivating to do the stuff. But not everybody will also have this purpose. They're not also going to necessarily have those goals or that contributing to people beyond themselves, and that's okay. Psychology might be something, and your work in psychology might be really meaningful. I hope it is, but it might not be one of the purposes to your life, and that's fine. So, benefits of purpose itself. It does help with identity development, especially in adolescence. I would suspect also for people who are older, you can develop identity all throughout your life. So generally in between the ages of about 16 to about 25, we first settle on an identity, and then it can change many times in life. So for example, becoming a parent might make some changes to your identity. So things like that, even other things like a career change or changing your major might shift your identity as well. So when you have purpose, those classes that you might be like, oh, why am I taking this class, tend to be more meaningful. You can generally tie things to that purpose, that you see these long-term goals around purposes that are beyond yourself, that are meaningful to you, and that helps those like day-to-day tasks or those day-to-day classes that might seem less important take on more importance because they're supportive of that final goal. It definitely fosters connection with others. A purpose has to have all those different components. It has to be meaningful, goal-oriented, and contributing to people beyond yourself. We'll give a couple examples of purpose in a minute, but it fosters connection with other people because you're doing things for other people in some way. It fosters self-efficacy as you see that you are accomplishing things that build self-efficacy. So when you have purpose and you're intrinsically motivated, you're going to be doing it, you're going to be doing better at it, you're going to develop self-efficacy because you can see that you're actually doing better. Greater positive affect. So positive affect is like feelings, so more positive feelings, so happiness, joy, those kinds of things. Higher resilience as well. You face a challenge, having a purpose can help get through that kind of challenge as well. So purpose does have really great benefits, and psychology is a field that tends to be for other people. So we've got things that hopefully it's meaningful to you. It's probably towards other people in some way, even if you're just analyzing data and that's all you're doing. It's probably data about people for something related to people. So it's pretty well suited to finding a purpose within the field of psychology. But again, you don't have to have a purpose in the field of psychology. But hopefully I do hope you find things meaningful in the field. So the careers in psychology do lend themselves well to finding a purpose. So what is purpose? What are some examples? Well, that meaningfulness, those things that you find meaningful, things that are useful or enjoyable, intrinsically motivating to you, that's meaning. And you can find that in a lot of different things. Goal-oriented. This is both long and short-term goals. So I'll show with some of these examples. We'll flip back and forth to this slide again. So it has to be goal oriented. It's like a far horizon goal, like way off in the distance, but as well as it's relevant to the goals that you have today, tomorrow, next week, next month. And it's beyond the self. So a purpose has to be related to something that you're engaging with that's meaningful to you, that you have goals around, as well as it's beyond just you. So one of the most common purposes is a purpose in family. So this is, again, I'm flipping back and forth here. So your family, you find interacting with them, hanging out with them, eating meals with them. You find these things to be meaningful. Being around them is a meaningful thing in and of itself. You might have goals with your family. You want to continue building these relationships. You want to maybe build a relationship with a sibling or a parent that hasn't been as strong recently. You want to get to know them better, know more about their life. These are maybe long-term as well as short-term goals. And it's beyond yourself. Obviously with family, it's other people. It's people around you. So that is one of the most common purposes that a lot of people have. So if you have that, great. If you don't, that's fine too. Not everybody has purpose in life around the age that most students in the class are as well. About a third of people. So other common examples, working for the environment. So I say specifically like working for the environment because you have to have goals around there. So something that could be personally meaningful or is personally meaningful to me is hiking. I love hiking. I love going out in the woods. Hopefully I can do it again once my knee is healed well, and I find it really meaningful. But just doing a hike in the woods is not really goal oriented. I might have the goal like go and do that. Right now I have kind of a more long-term goal to fix my knee up and go do that. But it's not really beyond myself. I'm not doing anything for others with that in any way. But caring for the environment is something that's a lot more likely to become purposeful because I might have goals, some sort of activism, planting trees, growing a garden, growing a community garden, things like this, working on getting more people solar power, something like that. Something around the environment, doing recycling. So this is to maybe benefit the world at large. That's people beyond yourself. You have goals related to that. So that's the difference between like meaning and purpose. So things that are meaningful can be intrinsically motivating, can be really beneficial and really useful. So, and I'm not discounting that meaning in psychology and meaning in your job is not the goal. That's what I do hope. That's like the minimum standard I'm hoping students have as majors in psychology, is finding meaning in their work. So I'm just kind of showing like this is purpose versus this is meaning. So other common examples, other forms of activism. So there might be social causes that are really important to you. That is something that could very well become purposeful. So for other people, goal-oriented, you're going to protests or doing things, doing activities. You find it meaningful, otherwise you probably wouldn't be doing it, right? So another thing is art. A lot of people find purpose in art. So you're creating something maybe to better the world or to better the world of art, to make the world more beautiful, things like that. You have goals. Maybe you need to increase your skills, keep them up, reach this kind of skill. So that's another common example of in the arts, a lot of people find purpose. So purpose does have great benefits. The careers in the psych field do lend themselves well to having these short and long-term goals, to be meaningful, as well as to be towards other people. So the psych fields, more than a lot of other fields, do lend themselves really well to finding purpose in that work. But again, you don't have to find purpose in that work. There's all these other kinds of purposes we just talked about that can make your life have a lot higher well-being. What I do hope is that you can take personal meaning in your work in psychology. Like at a bare minimum, I hope you're getting that you're getting that intrinsic motivation, that it's something that you enjoy, you want to be doing, that you find it useful or meaningful to yourself. So it doesn't have to be about people beyond yourself. It doesn't have to have short or long-term goals. That's the meaning exclusive part of it. So in a classroom, we would talk about what specific careers you might be doing, how might they fit these three things. So how might that career you're thinking of fit being personally meaningful? So again, I hope you have that as the base. How might it be goal oriented, both long term as well as short term goals? And beyond the self, what is it doing for others beyond just yourself? All right, so now that we've talked about meaning in a lot more, talking about the more recent research in meaning versus purpose. So again, meaning is kind of one of the components that makes up purpose. So what other things will you gain from psychology as you're going through your training, as you're going through this major, as you're going through various classes? What are you going to gain? So hopefully, we hope all these things happen, that you'll have a lot of strengthening of your own self-regulation. You're going to be taking classes, developmental classes, social psych classes, abnormal psych classes, cognitive psych classes. So especially in clinical programs where they're focusing explicitly on training for more work-life balance, that's kind of a big emphasis in those kinds of programs, not taking your work home, things like that. And also learning things that apply to people in general. So cognitive skills, self-regulation skills, empathy skills, that you might be using to help others can really apply to you as well. So you can take that knowledge and apply it to yourself too. Hopefully you're enhancing your leadership ability. So a lot of your classes might ask you to do, say, group work or take the lead on doing a big project like a literature review. Oftentimes in the field, a literature review is actually written by a team of writers. I've only written two, aside from classrooms, I've only written two literature reviews that were entirely done like by me, and I still used other people to edit and things like that and bounce ideas back and forth. So research on individual and group pressures might help you navigate group roles. So knowing more about social psychology, sociology, how people interact with each other, biases that we may have, can help you as you're working with people. So no matter what kind of occupation you're going into, whether it is psych field focus or not, those kinds of skills and basic knowledge that you're learning can really help. You're hopefully improving a lot of your communication skills. A lot of the assignments that we give, especially in the Salt Lake Community College departments, help to build communication skills. So person-to-person interaction, so training, working with partners, working with doing group projects, working on those kinds of skills. You're learning also about cultural, family, epigenetic, and neurodivergence differences, lots of differences within the human population. And so when we know those things about different people, it can help us hopefully interact with people that are more different than us, than you in your own lived experience, a little better, because you understand a lot more about the broader human spectrum. So hopefully you're deepening your empathy, your understanding, your ability to take someone's perspective, share their emotions. So empathy is that two-part thing. So feeling what someone else is feeling and being able to put yourself in their shoes or take their perspective. Hopefully you can do that better through the classes in your training in psychology. So this helps, one of the biggest things that helps build empathy, especially at like the adult level. There's other things that you can do in like early childhood, like encouraging to share, positively reinforce sharing behavior, for example. But in adulthood, working with people who you see as different from you is one of the best ways to help build empathy around and see their perspective, being able to put yourself in their shoes. So that's one of the biggest things for adults. And especially solving problems with others. So this can be like a crisis at a workplace that you have to solve together with a team. This could be writing a paper or doing a group project or something like that. That could be the problem that you're trying to solve. So the best kinds of problems to move you towards better empathy with people are things that you have to actually be working together for. So you might sometimes wonder, hey, why do I have to do all these group projects? I'm afraid my group won't actually do the work. Part of it's we're trying to help you build these kinds of skills beyond just the basic knowledge of psychology. So hopefully it works. Hopefully the other people in your group are developing empathy as well and help you in that work. So better decision-making ability. We've talked a few times just in our course, but hopefully in other courses you're getting this as well, about the cognitive shortcuts we use, how we can help avoid them when we have to make a really critical decision. Sometimes those cognitive shortcuts are just fine. One example of when cognitive shortcut is probably not fine is when some object jumps out in front of your car, something like that. You don't want to still be using those cognitive shortcuts. You want to be able to make a decision in that kind of instance. A new different situation comes up at work. Rather than going with your cognitive shortcuts, taking a step back, thinking about things, trying to analyze the situation, maybe looking at literature even to make a good decision. Hopefully you understand a little bit better of how to make good decisions. So we also hopefully are building an understanding that a lot of our perceptions might be a little distorted from actual reality. The way we see things might not necessarily be what you might call an objective way of seeing them. And then understanding human behavior can really help us find valid answers, and knowing about research can help us really search out and find good decisions to make on different topics and different subjects. So we're hopefully building better memory skills and student abilities. A few weeks ago we had literally an entire class devoted to memory skills and study skills. It fits really well with psychology. Cognitive psych classes I find to be really, really helpful, like learning how your brain works, processes things, processes information, uses its attention, uses its working memory. All of those can really help give you an understanding of how your brain really works and how to use that on, say, solving problems or doing your work or focusing on studying rather than getting on YouTube too much. Healthy behavior, so lifespan development and other courses are very focused on human thriving. So how do we help a human in early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood? How do we thrive at any point of that lifespan? You can take that home and do those same things for yourself. So physical health, social health, emotional well-being, all of these things we do research on to learn like how to help people thrive. You can apply that to your life. So some reasons not to major in psychology. These were all things that you'll gain from psychology, hopefully skills you will take. I thought there was another slide I had on communication skills. Maybe that's actually in chapter 4. Maybe I'm getting these confused. But another point on communication skills before we move on, and it might just end up being repetition, is that there's a lot of different ways that you'll communicate in various kind of occupations with people that are different. So people of different literacy levels, people who take in information differently. So maybe someone doesn't read very much. So while you're developing good skills in writing, we also want you to be able to speak well. So that's why different projects in the course are designed, this course as well as other courses, are trying to help improve your communication skills, because that's going to be really relevant no matter what kind of occupation you're in. Maybe your occupation you literally will never write a paper for. Maybe all you'll ever do is make like a visual presentation of like a PowerPoint and like speak to people. Maybe you won't even have any kind of visual. Maybe you'll just be speaking to people. So these are skills that we want you to build within the programs. All right, so if you have any of these current ideas, hopefully we dissuade you from these ideas with these discussions throughout this course, and as you see what the field of psychology is really like. So reasons not to continue majoring in psychology is a clinical or bust major. So undergrad psych classes focus on getting you the basics of all of psychology. So even though I criticize it sometimes for trying to pack too much too quick, the general psych class, like your 100 level classes, really try to get you a very broad, very surface level view of an entire field. So all of the classes that you take, say your social psych class, it's going to do that for the field of social psychology. As an example, in my grad school, there were like 13 types of social psych classes you could take. So essentially every chapter in a book there, you could take an entire graduate level class. For development, it's even more. My lifespan development book that I teach from is generally like 17 chapters. So a couple focused on childhood, middle childhood, late childhood, and then adolescence, middle, late adulthood. There were individual classes on each of those time spans for entire courses. Like over an entire semester, you might focus on adolescent socio-emotional development. So with that understanding, undergrad psych classes at associate's level, bachelor's level, they really try to get you a basics of those courses. So if you're wanting only to take clinical classes, just know that the classes that you take are not going to go necessarily as deep in the bachelor's or associate's level as you might want them to. It's trying to cover all of abnormal psych really quickly to get you a taste and slight understanding of everything. So a lot of students who really are very, very interested in clinical work are disappointed when they look at their course roster and they say, well, there's only really like 2 classes here that are really clinical focused. And that's true of most of the different majors too. But we tend to see a lot of clinical or bus majors that they're like, I only want to look at clinical psychology. That's all I care about. There's only 2 classes. I can finish that in a semester. Then what do I do with the rest of my time? I'm learning things that don't matter to me. So hopefully you can see that there are other ways of helping people beyond just clinical work. So that's one thing. So taking a social psych class, taking a developmental psych class, taking even a history of psych class, an IO psych class, hopefully you can see that there are other ways to help people within psychology and that those fields collaborate well with each other and will help you understand this clinical field. So if you are clinical focused but you don't have any understanding of developmental psych or social psych, that's going to be a detriment to you. So it can be disappointing to look at a course roster and be like, there's really only 2 clinical classes. That does tend to be about what you'll find across the board for undergrad psych classes. So things like education, evaluation, and creating interventions are some other ways that I didn't even mention yet, are ways that you can help people. So educational psychology is an entire field, has its own journals on using psychology within education. How do we teach psychology? How do we teach people in general using psychology? Evaluation. That can go anywhere from evaluating a company to evaluating a program that you've created, an intervention to help do something or build people. So if you have, psychology is a science. So you'll be learning and hopefully understanding better how to do science. So the first half of this class really has focused more on like the field of psychology in general. The second half is going to go really hard into research methods specifically. So how do we actually do the science? We've got a little bit of taste of it here or there, but psychology is a science. You'll be learning and understanding how to do science. So with that, you're going to be examining relationships between variables, using consistent research methods or learning about them, reading, writing science. So if you don't like science or you don't like an emphasis on science, a psych major might not be as exciting if you don't learn to love these things about science. And now with that being said, I'm not saying that you have to really love statistics, but learning to gain an appreciation of how do we do science, how to do science well, is really going to help you for those bigger, broader concepts, because the only way we develop those concepts is through scientific investigation. So statistics, taking time to do things the best, most accurate way, and using creativity to come up with new ways to do science, that's all core to doing good science. So if you're not willing to do or learn science, it might be a hard major for you. It might be a little difficult for you to find interest in classes when all we talk about all the time is this study says this is how we did this study, this is how we know to do X, Y, or Z. So it might make it more challenging. So hopefully we can interest you in the process of doing science. That's one of my favorite things to do. I find a lot of meaning in doing that is helping students see, oh yeah, science is really neat. Might not do as good of a job as Bill Nye the Science Guy, but I feel like I'm taking some of that energy into this class. So if you don't like reading or reading is difficult for you, one, if reading is difficult for you, there's a lot of tools to help you with your reading. There's the Disability Resource Center, for example, that might have specific tools that you might not even be aware of that could help you with reading. So with this, nearly all valid psych knowledge is delivered through written material in journals. So if you have a hard time with reading, find supports for that. There are supports at the university level. There's other tools that you can bring in as well to help you with reading. If you need to listen to it rather than actually read it, there are tools to help you do that. So obviously you can listen to that material as well. I've had students who have those programs that listen to it even in classes and things like that if we have to read over something. And that is great, but there is a lot of material delivered in that kind of written format. So figuring out the tools to help you be able to use that information is important. So you'll need to be able to comprehend, not necessarily, again, read it. You might be able to listen to it, but comprehend and incorporate many ideas. And so a lot of what we do has a lot of reading focus, taking in a lot of new ideas. You come to class, I talk about it in a slightly different way, give more examples, hopefully, to help you build your knowledge base and understand how these variables all connect to these variables and these variables and these variables. So with this, a minimum of 7 psych research studies is required for your lit review, and that's still a pretty low bar for getting a full understanding of a subject. So more reading is definitely required. I'm hoping that you all have at least 10 papers that you cite in your lit review, but even then, 7-10 papers to get a good understanding, even on your focused topics. That's still a pretty small number of studies to really get a sense of what the field is doing in an area, but that's okay at this level. It's a one class assignment or a one semester assignment. It's getting you a taste of a lit review, a taste of a focused experience in a field, but you're not going to know everything about that subject at the end of this lit review. So with that, take a couple minutes to write down and answer some of these questions from the chapter. So like literally just open up a Word document kind of thing, or pull out a notepad and write down any of these questions, because some of the next kind of lectures that we have will answer some of these or hopefully help. It's nice that when doing this video, I can take a sip of water easier than in a classroom with a mask on. But yeah, write down any of the answers to these questions that are important to you, matter to you. So what goals or values underlie your rationale for choosing psych as a major? What excites you about majoring in psychology? What concerns do you have? How will you respond to well-meaning people who try and convince you to switch from psychology? What are some options you can pursue if psych, or the specific career path as well within psych, turns out not to be a good fit? So again, skills that you have, things like that you could use within a psych-focused field, even if it's not the one that you had originally intended to, or in the wider job market as well. So take some time, even though we're not in a classroom here in this digital format, do take a few minutes to write down answers to these questions for the end of this chapter's class period, essentially. And I believe that's all for chapter 3. Yep. And so I'll see you again for chapter 4.